This company was trusted with millions of lives, and somehow, it started cutting corners. Boeing wasn't just another aviation company. It was the gold standard, the safest way to fly. So how does a company like that start making decisions that put everything at risk? Because if you look at what's happened over the last few years, you don't just see isolated mistakes. You start to see a pattern, and that pattern points to something much deeper than a single failure. This isn't just a story about planes. It's a story about what happens when a company slowly stops building and starts calculating. Today, we're not just looking at what went wrong with Boeing. We're running a full audit, not just on the aircraft, but on the decisions, the incentives, and the culture that quietly reshaped the entire company. And more importantly, Boeing might not be the only company this is happening to. To understand how it got here, we have to go back to the moment everything changed. Not to a crash, but to a decision. 1997, the year Boeing didn't just merge with another company. It rewrote its own DNA. In 1997, Boeing acquired its longtime rival, McDonnell Douglas. On paper, it was a display of dominance, a victory lap for a titan. In reality, it was a Trojan horse. McDonnell Douglas was a failing company. Their management had already proven they prioritized financial engineering over actual aeronautical engineering. Here is where the audit identifies the fatal flaw. When the merger closed, the Boeing board didn't absorb the McDonnell Douglas leadership. They were replaced by them. The executives from a declining company suddenly took the controls of the industry leader. This wasn't a change in management. It was a fundamental inversion of the company's DNA. Overnight, the corporate philosophy flipped. The objective shifted from, how do we build the safest, most advanced aircraft, to, how do we maximize shareholder value today? They began stripping away the long-term R&D protections that kept Boeing's standards untouchable. They moved the headquarters from Seattle, the heart of their engineering talent, to Chicago, physically distancing the executives from the factory floor. It was a systematic dismantling of an engineering-first culture. They stopped measuring success by the safety and performance of the plane and started measuring it by the stock price and the speed of production. This was the moment the rot took hold. They didn't just merge two companies. They institutionalized short-termism at the expense of long-term integrity. Now, let's talk about the dirty secret of the modern Boeing. When you prioritize quarterly earnings over everything else, you look for the fastest way to shrink the cost of goods sold. You look at your supply chain and you see fat that needs to be trimmed. Boeing's leadership looked at the thousands of components required to assemble a jet and made a cold calculation. Building these parts in-house was too expensive, too slow, and too labor-intensive. So, they made the move. They began an aggressive campaign to outsource the production of critical systems to third-party suppliers. They told investors it was about flexibility. They told the public it was about efficiency. But an audit reveals the truth. It was a transfer of risk. By farming out the construction of major sections of their aircraft, from fuselage panels to flight control systems, they didn't just save money. They severed the most vital connection in aviation, the connection between the designer and the manufacturer. They traded their internal expertise for a contract, hoping that a cheaper supplier could replicate the precision of a Boeing engineer. They couldn't. But the rot didn't stop there. Once you outsource the build, you outsource your eyes. They lost visibility over the very parts that kept their planes in the air. They were no longer building planes. They were managing a frantic, fragmented assembly line of outsourced, undervetted parts. The result wasn't efficiency. It was a loss of control so profound that Boeing effectively became a glorified middleman in the construction of its own aircraft. They gambled that they could buy quality from the lowest bidder. And they lost. But the collapse of the supply chain was only half the story. The true, structural failure wasn't just in the factories, it was in the boardrooms and the offices. Boeing developed a culture of silence. When you incentivize leadership based on quarterly stock performance and aggressive delivery targets, you inevitably create an environment where the truth becomes an obstacle. In a high-pressure, speed-obsessed environment, no became a forbidden word. Engineers and quality control specialists found themselves in an impossible position. If they flagged a defect or questioned a timeline, they weren't thanked for their diligence. They were labeled as bottlenecks. They were told they were costing the company money. They were told to get it done. This is the Incentive trap. When your career and your bonuses are tied to meeting production numbers, you don't reward the person who pauses the line to report a safety concern. You reward the person who gets the plane out the door. Boeing essentially institutionalized a "don't ask, don't tell" policy regarding production defects. They didn't just ignore the warnings, they created a system where the people who knew the truth were incentivized to keep it to themselves. You cannot maintain safety standards in a system that punishes the truth tellers. Once you build a company where the message is, "make it work, no matter what," you have already guaranteed the catastrophe. The rot didn't just live in the manufacturing process. It lived in the very people who were supposed to be Boeing's conscience. But the rot wasn't just an internal problem. It eventually punched a hole in the fuselage. The 737 MAX wasn't a technical glitch. It was the inevitable manifestation of the systems we just audited. When you outsource your expertise and silence your engineers, you don't just build a plane with errors, you build a plane with fatal vulnerabilities that are baked into the design philosophy itself. Boeing tried to solve their stock price problem by cramming new, heavy engines onto an airframe designed in the 1960s. They knew the plane was unstable. Instead of redesigning it, they built a software band-aid, MCOS, and they buried that information so deep that the pilots flying the plane didn't even know it existed. They didn't just hide a defect. They essentially gambled with the lives of every passenger on board to save on the cost of pilot training and structural recertification. That isn't an engineering failure. That is a calculated liability. When the news broke and the grounding began, the company's first reaction wasn't transparency. It was damage control. They spent months trying to frame the disaster as a pilot error, a training issue, anything except what it actually was, a corporate crime. They thought they were managing a balance sheet. In reality, they were managing a disaster that they had spent 20 years building. The audit doesn't lie. The 737 MAX was the moment the Boeing Corporation ceased to be an aviation leader and fully transitioned into a corporate liability. So, where does that leave us today? We aren't looking at a company undergoing a genuine recovery. We are looking at a company attempting to survive the consequences of its own legacy. The truth is clear: you cannot fix Boeing by simply changing the CEO, updating a training manual, or installing a few extra bolts. The DNA of the corporation was permanently altered in 1997, and the rot has reached the bone. They are trying to solve a systemic, cultural collapse with superficial PR, but the math doesn't work. The tragedy of Boeing is that they had everything: the unparalleled talent, the engineering history, the global trust, and they traded it all for a higher share price. They proved that even the biggest, most indestructible companies can be destroyed by their own leadership. We are witnessing the slow-motion collapse of a titan. But the real lesson here isn't just about aviation. It's about the warning signs. If this is what happens when a company stops building and starts calculating, you have to wonder, who is next? What other giants are rotting from the inside out while we look the other way? The audit doesn't lie. Boeing is a cautionary tale, but it won't be the last one we examine. This is the audit. Subscribe for the next deep dive, because trust me, there are plenty more companies waiting to be examined.